Okay, I did not think this was going to be so difficult, but this is apparently round three. And the topic I've been contemplating for the day is this idea that started with Talvin Shahar in Happier, whether or not happiness is the ultimate currency. And the challenge I've been having is that as a person who's gone through and passed all three levels of the Chartered Financial Analyst program, I've had some background in economics, and the question is can happiness actually be a currency? Has been something that's on my mind because this has been grating at me. And if I start with Wikipedia, the idea is that a currency is the most specific sense, a currency in the most specific sense is money in any form when in use or circulation as a medium of exchange, especially circulating banknotes and coins. And banknotes and coins, it's pretty much something that we see with like the US dollar or the Japanese yen or the euro. But this idea of a medium of exchange is one of the three fundamental functions of money in mainstream economics. And it's the idea that it can be we can exchange things for goods or services. So John Law, for example, once said that money is the value by which, not for which, goods are exchanged. And the assumption here is that this is a form of exchange between two parties or multiple parties. And I don't feel like happiness is something that we necessarily trade. Like I can't go to you and say it's like, well, I'm willing to trade like 3 units of my happiness for 3 units of your happiness, or I'm willing to make you miserable for X amount of units of happiness. So I'll give you money in exchange, like, you're going to be miserable. Like there's no, or you're going to receive money and that's going to be automatically assumed with some level of joy. So I feel like this idea of looking at happiness as a currency, which is money, currency, which is a money, and then getting into like medium of exchange, I feel like that's it's too far removed, and I don't feel like it's the right metaphor. The next thing that I look at is if we're looking at money, is that money itself is also a unit of account, which is a function of money. So that means that it's a way to measure the value of something in a specific currency. Yeah, for example, it allows different things to be compared against each other. For example, the value of someone else's time to mow a lawn, or the amount of time, amount of time spent, like we would pay somebody at like my software company to produce an hour of to write code for an hour. And then the general stuff of like assets, like how much is a house worth versus how much is a car. So a house might be worth 10 times as much as a car, and a car in turn may be worth 20,000 loaves of bread. And how we are able to function in society is greatly aided by this common shared system that we think of as money. And if you move on, then we have this idea of like a store of value. So like when we think about store of value, something that can be saved. Well, I can't really save happiness. I can't just like internally have a bank that says, you know what, I had like I had 15 positive days, and then on the 16th day something bad can happen, and that can totally deplete the account. And so I don't necessarily feel like there's the static value. And that like fills a bucket or depletes a bucket, and in that sense that like sometimes you can talk about like a common store value being like in terms of commodities, like I can have bars of gold I keep in my apartment, but I can't exactly stock up on something that spoils, like fruit. Like I may have a million apples, but it turns out for me like a million apples would be far worse than having like 5 apples. And so in that sense, I find that like you can't actually define a unit of happiness that actually can be stored. I feel like happiness is ephemeral. So then you get into like a standard of deferred payment is the final function of money, and again we're not in a point where when we talk about standards, we're talking about other people, and we really can't agree and say that my level 3 of happiness is the same as your level 3 of happiness. And like the things I'm willing to struggle with are going to be different than things that you're willing to struggle with. And I feel like that's where this idea of trying to equate or use money as a metaphor for happiness is intrinsically risky. And so if I also take a look at like the general, like another section talks about the let's see, where did that go? Um, I had this all queued up the first time. If I take a look at the properties of money, yeah, the first thing is fungibility. The units must be capable of mutual substitution. So this idea that $10 is worth twice as much as $5 and $20 is worth 4 times as much as 5 is something that we've come to accept, and mathematically that works out very well. But I don't see how a day like 8 units of happiness is or a day that produces 8 units of happiness, or a class 8 day is better than a class 4 day. And so understanding like, is this like logarithmic? So maybe was it 2 to the third is 8 and 2 to the second is 4. So an 8 is maybe 50% better than a 4. But then if I think about it in terms of grades, like a 4-point GPA is a lot rarer than a like 3.6. And so maybe it's better to have a day that's like a 9 than it is to have a day that's a set of days that's a 7. So I feel like getting a better understanding of what does it mean to have an A day, or like 90% days, 90% plus days, versus a series of C days, which is like 70% when I was back in high school. That's something that I'm going to like think about more later. The other stuff like durability, the ability to withstand repeated use. I feel like when it comes to money, and I think about durability, it's like, okay, if I use the example of skydiving, I might be really scared, and that might be initially a negative experience, but after the second, third jump, I might really love the rush, or I might love it from the first time. But if I'm going 10 times in a day, by the 10th time, I could very well be exhausted and not really enjoy the process anymore. And I think that it's also possible the novelty wears off. So I don't know if you can actually look at happiness as being durable. We talk about portability, easily carried or transported. I don't know even if happiness like translates between environments. Like I may have amazing relationship at home and a rough relationship at work, and the moment I step foot in the office, like I can feel anxious and already worn out at the beginning of the day. And likewise, it might be the opposite, where I go to the office for reprieve. So I feel like, yep, it's difficult. I think you kind of have to fire on all cylinders in order to really say that you have a, yeah, joyous and happy life. So yeah, I don't see portability as one of the natures of happiness. Uh, Cognizability. So can we? The value must be easily identified. Uh, I feel like because there's so much question on like what makes us happy. That alone states that like happiness is a currency. I think that yes, we know when we're happy, and so in that sense, it's easily identified. But to actually think about it, and I think um, that's where the work begins. And finally, you talk about the stability of value. The value shouldn't fluctuate. And again, when it comes to like number of skydives or number of pieces of cake or number of apples, it's not the value of happiness is actually pretty unstable. So the stuff that we're willing to like trade time for and think about anticipate happiness, I don't think that there's a good analog between the two. So in the general accounts, I feel like happiness fails as a currency. So if it's not that, then what is it? Currently, I've been thinking of it, the nature of happiness as a flow. So you can think of like amount of happiness generated during a day, and so yeah, you can kind of add up number of great things that happen a day, number of like crappy things that happen a day, and kind of like net them off and kind of document how your day went, and like number of days of happy days like sum up into a week. And I think there's going to be some exercises for people to say that, is it better to have like mediocre days followed by like one home run? Or is it better in general to ignore the home runs and have like better than average days? So have good days every day, but never have a great or amazing experience, or is it better to have like mediocre days followed by a great experience? And I think that's going to be something that each person has to discover for themselves. So in that sense, I feel like yes, there is the general recognition that we have personal value and happiness, but trying to equate it with something external, I think is a dangerous path because of the idea that like happiness is not easily quantified. So we need to come up with our own like personal establishments of value. Maybe it is possible that currency is a good word, and we have our own internal metric for how this should be decided. But at the same time, we also need to understand what the limitations are when we look at happiness as being fungible. The joy that comes from a eureka experience at work after solving a tough problem is different from the joy that comes from being with a loved one, and I feel like trying to treat those two as equal, can in the long run lead people to to not experiencing like the happiness they actually seek. So that's currently my challenge for the day, and where my head's at. And I will talk to you soon.